Why did Jesus come? What verses might come to your mind if we took a couple minutes and made a list? What would be the reasons that Jesus came? There's probably 2 or 3 that would first come to our mind, and passages maybe that would come to mind. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34, Jesus gives us one of the many reasons for why he came. And when you think about why he came, does a sword, does that come to mind? Jesus came. Is there anything that he came that would, or is his reasons for coming, does a sword come to mind when you think about why he came? That's what Jesus says here in Matthew 10 and verse 34. He says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Why did Jesus say this when in other passages he is called the Prince of Peace? And the answer is that in the fact that every statement that anybody makes, Jesus, when we're talking about the Bible, or anything we read or anything we say, everything has a context. And the occasion in which something is said, and what is said before that, always informs and defines what is said and what is meant by what is said. So why would Jesus say that he came to bring a sword? Well, let's look here around, look at the things that were said before this, and they'll help and make this crystal clear. In verses 1 through 6, Jesus is sending the 12 apostles out, and he says that he's sending them to the lost sheep of Israel. So, of course, at this point, they were not going into all the world and taking the gospel to every creature, but just to the lost house of Israel, and notice that, or the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then in verses 7 through 42, then he goes into much more detail in preparing them for the work that they're about to go into. If you think about it, up to this point, they had only been with Jesus, and in verses 1 through 4, we see even it had been recent that they were given some specific tasks. There were many who followed Jesus, but there were some whom he called to a special task. And so that had only been recently given. And so now they're going out, but they won't be at Jesus' ankles. They won't have him to look to and to talk to. So he's preparing them to go out. In verses 7 through 10, he tells them some of the physical provisions that they were to take, and to not take too much and to not take too little. And then in verses 11 through 15, he tells them that there would be some who would receive them. So it's not all bad news. There would be some that would welcome them into their homes. And so he tells them, you go and stay with them. But then he also tells them that they are actually going to be rejected by most of the people whom they had heard. Now, anytime we read, we often are including everything we know about Jesus and his work. But remember, to this point, this is still fairly early on in Jesus' work. He hasn't been as outwardly opposed. There have been occasions here and there, but we're just here in Mark chapter 10, fairly early in the work of Jesus. So the disciples were going to see many more things later that would show them what Jesus meant when he talked about himself and them being rejected, but they hadn't seen the worst of that yet. And so he's preparing them for what they're going to see at this phase of their work. In verses 16 through 23, he gets even more specific. He tells them, I don't know that this is limited to this particular work he's sending them out to. I think it would include even later. But he tells them, you're going to be arrested, beaten, you're going to be taken to court and be tried, and you're going to be hated. So it's one thing to be told you're going to be rejected, because rejected might mean, well, people just won't show up. They just won't hear, and they won't do what you say. They'll just ignore you. You can be ignored, and that's one way to be rejected, and that's not a pleasant response to receive from anyone, especially if you care about them. But he defines and refines what he means when he says you're going to be rejected. They're going to come back at you because they hate you. Verses 24 through 33 is a little more familiar section maybe. But at first it would be striking, surprising maybe. After being told you're going to be arrested, rejected, taken to court, beaten, and hated, next thing Jesus says is, but don't fear. maybe you know the rest of the verse, but just if you can put yourself in their shoes and their sandals, as they listen, they're told how bad it's going to be, and then Jesus says, but don't fear. At least don't fear those who can kill the body. After being told you're going to be arrested and beaten, he says, but don't fear those who can do those things to your body. Well, my ears might tingle. I might get the shivers a little bit from hearing that. He says, but don't worry, but rather fear him. You remember this verse. Rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. So, of course, they would be a little bit worried and concerned about being arrested, beaten, thrown into prison. But he says that might be bad, but it can be worse. So you keep your eyes on who you fear the most. And, of course, that's not Satan. Satan is not the one who's going to destroy you, body and soul, in hell. He doesn't have that power. He'll be destroyed. He's telling them, you keep the fear of God first in your mind and in your heart as you go out and as you face these circumstances. So it's in this context then, verses 34 through 39, when Jesus makes this statement that we read in verse 34. After having talked about those who are going to fight and hate the message as well as the messengers. As he speaks of these who, their enemies, remember, he's going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So in this part of their work, the people they're going to are not going to be saying, well, we hate your God. It's not going to be like Goliath. Who is your God? They weren't going to defy in name the God in whose name these disciples were going out. But they were going to be facing people who rejected some particular part of the message that was going out. And they were going to hate that message enough that they would be willing to do the things that Jesus had told them would happen. So there have always been people like this. Always have been people who would claim some allegiance to God, but there's some part of the message from God that they don't accept, and they reject it so strongly that they're willing to go on the attack against the people bringing that message. That was Cain and Abel. Cain would not have outright said, I defy the God who created my parents and the garden, and the one where there's that flaming sword. He would have known all that and could have seen all of that. He wouldn't have said, I defy that God, but did he? He did, even to the point that he killed Abel. You can think of kings in the history of Israel and even some in Judah that would not have defied God in name, but by the messengers that came and by even the teachings that had already been given. They rejected that, and they even would attack those who brought the message. And in fact, that's really the history of the majority of the Israelites. Most of the Jews were of this kind, that they wouldn't in name defy God, but at some point there was some teaching or group of teachings that so conflicted something that was more important to them, that while they claimed allegiance to God, they not only would reject the message of God and the messengers of God, but they would fight against them and push them out and sometimes even kill them. So what Jesus is telling them is going to happen is what they could have been able to recognize really had always been the case. So it's in this context of Jesus saying, you're going out and you're going to be confronted, you're going to be resisted. That's the context, and those are the people that he's talking about when he said, I did not come to bring peace. He did not come to bring peace with people who, even if they claim to desire God and peace with God, but they reject what he has said. Those are the people to whom Jesus came, not to make peace, but to bring a sword. Jesus, of course, didn't come and initiate the battle. Jesus came into the middle of the battle. The battle started, at least on earth, in the Garden of Eden. And that battle had been raging for thousands of years before Jesus came. And so Jesus was willing to leave heaven and come engage in a battle and bring a sword and lead the fight. But then what he's telling the disciples here is, you also have a part in this. I came to bring a sword, but you also have a sword. And I expect you to fight in this battle. And this battle is going to put you in conflict sometimes, even with the closest to you on this earth. Verses 35 through 39, that section where he says it may be father against mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, son or daughter, father or mother. And he says if you're not willing to carry the sword even into your home at times, he says then you're not worthy of me. And so Jesus left heaven to engage in this fight, and then he's telling us, it's not just that I came and fought the battle for you. He did the things we couldn't do, but you've got to be committed enough to this. You've got to be more committed to this than even to those closest to you in your own household. So this is the context in which Jesus said, I did not come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. He came to bring a sword to these. Now, what kind of a sword did Jesus bring? We're mostly going to stay in Matthew. I'll jump over to John for just a moment, but if your Bible's in Matthew, if you want to stay there or mark it, we'll primarily be there this morning. What kind of sword, though, did Jesus bring? When Jesus was being arrested in John chapter 18, Peter, he brought a sword on that occasion. You remember what he did with it? Cut off the ear of one of those who were in the company of those who had come to arrest him. And Jesus said in verse 11, put your sword back in its sheath. This is why I've come. So Jesus revealed other reasons why he came. But he makes the point, I didn't come to change people's mind by sticking a sword and cutting off the ear of those who resist me. And then Jesus made that even more clear in John chapter 18 and verse 36 in talking to Pilate, when Pilate starts digging in a little bit, as though he's really interested in the facts. I don't know. But Jesus tells him, my kingdom is not of this world, and if I told my servants to fight, they would, but my kingdom is not from here. So Jesus made it clear. Yes, he brought a sword, and he made it clear the kind of sword he did not bring. Jesus did not come and tell his disciples then or today, well, you go out and you'll spread this message and you'll defend yourself with a physical sword in this work I've given for you to do. Now, are there any who have that approach, who take that approach to spiritual things and to religion? They do. The Quran says this in a chapter called The Cow. It says, fight for the sake of God those that fight against you, but do not attack them first. God does not love the aggressors. Slay them wherever you find them. Drive them out of the places from which they drove you. If they attack you, put them to the sword. So this qualifies it a little bit. This section says, well, don't use the sword on some occasions, but this clearly says there are some occasions where the way that you will practice the religion of Allah is you'll use the sword. And if they came and took you out of your home, then you'll go and you'll fight for God and you'll use the sword and you'll drive them away. Now, it might be helpful to note, not all Muslims take this passage literally, and others like it. Just like there are Christians or people who claim to follow the Bible, but who don't take the Bible literally. They say, well, Genesis chapter 1, that's just kind of figurative language, and it wasn't really 6 days, it wasn't really 24-hour normal day. So there are people who literal or who figurative, make things figurative, and they treat many of the things. Some people even say that about the resurrection of Jesus. And that, well, it wasn't a bodily, physical resurrection, and they just make it figurative. So there are people who take that approach. There are Muslims who take that approach with the Quran, and they would explain this away and say, well, no, this is not really what we're supposed to do today. But that's just people who don't take, that would describe Muslims, who might be called liberal Muslims. They just don't take the book literally and consider what it says and what it originally meant when it was said. Just like there are some people who treat the Bible the same way. But for those who do, for those who take the Quran seriously, then it tells them there are times to take up the sword for the sake of Allah. They're not the only ones. The Catholic Church has done that at times. Now, in more recent times, the Catholic Church has not taken that approach. Here, a Catholic news source says Jesus does not need an army to fight evil in the world. He uses the victorious weapons of love and humility, according to their Pope. And yet, the time called the Crusades is pretty well known. Anybody with a little bit of introduction to world history, and New Advent is a Catholic encyclopedia. So I'm just telling you, this is how they describe their history, not someone else describing them. And so they admit all crusades were announced by preaching. After pronouncing a solemn vow, each warrior received a cross from the hands of the Pope or his legates and was thenceforth considered a soldier of the cross. Not like stand up for Jesus, the strife will not like that. But of course, these were people going out with the literal sword, and they were in a literal army and literal armor, and they were going out and killing people to take back land. Which is interesting because that sounds a lot like what the Quran said that the Muslims would do, and of course that's who often they were fighting. And so since the Catholic Pope is said to be the personal representative of Jesus, you have to ask the question, well, which Pope was the representative of Jesus? The one who handed out, who gave each warrior a cross and then a shield and a sword? Or the one who said Jesus doesn't need that? And they'll have to answer for that. And sometimes maybe not always in the first conversation, but maybe there are people we know that at some point in time they've been taught this faith, and we can help them to see contradictions such as this. But Jesus came to bring a sword, not that kind of a sword. And so what did Jesus mean? What kind of a sword did Jesus bring? And so we're going to stay in the book of Matthew to find that answer. Go over to Matthew chapter 11 and verse 20. Matthew chapter 11 and verse 20. Here, one of the occasions where Jesus brings out the sword. He began to rebuke the cities in which most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. And then he goes on to name specifically city after city and rebukes them for rejecting the things that he had done. Notice this is, again, still relatively early in Jesus' work, when he had primarily done his work in the towns around the Sea of Galilee, which is in the area of Nazareth where he was born. So here were people who, some of them knew him even from his youth. And yet, even early on, when he had done the miracles in these places, they had some excuse for why they rejected him. Well, this is just the carpenter's son. Or, well, we heard Jesus said that a Gentile had great faith. There must not be any knowledge in him. Doesn't he know we're the Jews? And so Jesus took out the sword and rebuked them. And if you keep reading, he says some pretty strong and serious things in verse 23. Even said that you're as bad or worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, referring back to that time. Not because of the specific things they were practicing, but because they had rejected what was available to them. And so we have to be willing to take up the same kind of sword, because our society, like these cities, and not just our society, as our world, continues just to ignore and to reject and to resist the knowledge that's available to them. Then our world, our society, our country, maybe more specifically our community, just rejects the knowledge that's available. And so what's our responsibility if we recognize Jesus brought a sword and expects us to take it? What's our responsibility? Well, our job is to patiently, but to persistently show them the knowledge that they need. Things like Hebrews 3 verse 4, that every house has a builder. Do you know anybody that would be controversial to them, with them? Every house has a builder, and he who built all things is God. Something doesn't come from nothing. Nobody lives their life that way, makes their decisions based upon the idea that something comes from nothing. So our job is to patiently and persistently help people see the knowledge that's available to them. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter also talks about scoffers, and he lays out the evidence for them. In chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, he says, we have the prophetic word confirmed. So every generation from then until today has a record of the mighty works that have been done, the prophecies that have been done. And so when there are people who scoff at that and reject that today, then our job, patiently but persistently, is to share the knowledge, to show the knowledge, and then also be sure we live what we teach. Because what will scoffers do when they hear us say one thing, but if they see our life contradicts that, it just gives them another paper airplane in their arsenal. Not anything that's worthy of any genuine attack, but it enlarges their ego. And so what is our conduct teaching? We've got to pay attention to that. What did Jesus use his sword against? Look at Matthew chapter 15. In Matthew 15, when the Pharisees had one of many occasions to complain against Jesus and his disciples, well, then Jesus in verse 3 says, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition?" He says in verse 9, "In vain they worship me," quoting Isaiah. So this had been a problem in the past, and Jesus says it's still true. "In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." He goes on to say more, so that the multitudes who were there would get the idea of what he was talking about. And in verse 12, later the disciples came to him and said, "Do you not know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" So Jesus stuck them with the sword. Maybe more like a surgeon trying to operate, trying to help and bring some change. But he answered the question of the disciples, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind, leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into the ditch." Now notice, though Jesus says they're blind, he's still trying to teach. He's still trying to teach them, and he's helping others to learn as well in that. But Jesus points out they gave as much or more attention to the traditions of man than they did the commandments of God. Doesn't mean they totally ignore the commandments of God, but they put the traditions of man on a level that was sometimes equal to the commandments of God, sometimes elevated above the commandments of God. So if we're going to enter into this same fight, if we're going to take up the same sword, it's got to be against the same enemy. And Paul warned about the doctrines and commandments of men in Colossians chapter 2. And so if Jesus did that and then Paul did that, then we have to be willing to engage in the same. In the next upcoming days and weeks, we will see examples of what Jesus was talking about. When man gives more or even equal attention to man's traditions than they do the commandments of God, then we get the idea of what Jesus was fighting against. And so in the religious season of Christmas and of Easter, I'm not talking about family time is fine, but when Christmas and Easter are viewed as holy days of the church, these are times for all spiritual people to recognize this or that. What we see is that most commonly, those are given more attention than the Lord's Day. We sang in the song a few minutes ago, "Here we bring our offering on this holy day." Well, who made the Lord's Day a holy day? God did. Who made Christmas a holy day? Who made Easter a holy day? The teachings of man, the traditions of man, the commandments of man. And so when those days are given equal, if not more attention than the holy day that God did, then we're seeing the same kind of problem that Jesus had in his day. And patiently, we want to teach, but patiently we have to say something. Go to chapter 16. But the problems were not always just among the Pharisees or the Sadducees. In Matthew chapter 16, after Jesus begins to prepare his disciples for what was going to happen to him in Jerusalem, he was going to be killed but raised the third day. Well, it's as though Peter didn't hear Jesus say anything about being raised. It's like all Peter heard was, "I'm going to be killed." And then Peter jumps in after Jesus finishes and said, "Oh no, far be it from you, Lord. This won't happen to you." And then I don't remember many, I don't know if I can remember any occasion where Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Get behind me, Satan." He reserved that rebuke for Peter. Remember that? Verse 23, he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Peter thought he had some insight that Jesus didn't have. And, well, Lord, there can be another way for all this to happen. You don't need to die. You don't need to suffer. And so Jesus brought the sword out of its sheath, again, for the purpose of helping Peter. And it's to Peter's credit. Peter didn't stomp off. "Well, how dare you?" Peter learned the lesson little by little. But Peter did not have any insight into Jesus' work that Jesus did not understand. Sometimes there are Christians who claim some kind of insight. Consider this: the adoption, the redemption of the body, the inheritance, resurrection to life. You know what that's talking about? This one says, came at the fall of Jerusalem. The primary resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is past. There are Christians teaching this. Sometimes it's called the 70 AD doctrine or realized eschatology. Whatever the label is, this is the teaching that the resurrection has already happened. And they claim some insight into passages. 1 Corinthians 15, there's some difficult things in that passage, but it's not all hard, is it? It talks about the body is going to be raised. The literal physical body of ours and of all people are going to come out of the ground. And yet there are brethren who say, well, no, that's already happened. Ironically, in 2 Peter 2:18, there were already people saying that in the beginning of the gospel. Paul wrote and warned Timothy that there were some who say that the resurrection is already past. And so that teaching had already, or some akin like it, teaching akin to it, was already being taught in the time of Paul. And so Jesus brought the sword out against people who claimed to have some insight that contradicted what God had already said. Go over to Matthew chapter 20, but sometimes it isn't always some doctrine or some teaching. There are other things that Jesus took equally as strong an approach against, strong enough we could say, that he used the sword. In Matthew chapter 20, one of the occasions where there was a squabble among the disciples because some wanted to be great, and so two came to Jesus and said, well, let us sit on your right and your left hand. Actually, it was the mother of some who did that. Whatever conversations happened behind closed doors to get to that point, I don't know, but that request was made and the other disciples learned about it, and then they were all picking sides. And so Jesus brings out the sword in verses 25 and 26 and says, but Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. So someone whose decisions are based on acquiring authority, acquiring to be the desire to be honored. People who make their decisions on the basis of, well, I want people to think that I'm the wise one, that they would come to me for counsel, so that my ideas are the ones that everybody follows. That was the mindset even of these. And Jesus says, I have a sword for that. And so we have to use the same sword on the same desires, whether they are in us or even sometimes among the Lord's people. And one of the ways where that is tested is in the work of Christians in working together as a church. When there are Christians who have agreed, who have committed to working together, that's what membership is. Christians committing to work together. It's not just because they live in the same place. But when they commit to work together, when we make a commitment to work with other people, that's going to test our humility. Because unless you're going to live, and some people do, unless you're going to live out in Alaska on the hillside in a cabin all by yourself, in that case, your desires always win. You always get the way that the way that you want. But if you're going to add one other person in marriage, or if you're going to add several others and be a church together, then your way is not always going to be the way. And your schedule and your plans and your preferences are sometimes going to have to take a back seat to others. Not only to God's, of course, but just in the nature of working together with other humans, whether it's at the workplace or in marriage or in the church, then the one who will be great is not the one aspiring for everybody to follow them and their every whim and their every opinion, but is someone who's going to be willing to be the servant. And when someone like Diotrephes in 3 John 9, remember he loved to have the preeminence. So he wanted to be the one calling the shots. He wanted to be the one everyone came to inform and to ask, and then he would make his judgment, and then everybody should follow that. If that's what you want, well then you won't be following the Lord, and you will not help there to be peace among the Lord's people. If that just won't work, it shall not be so, Jesus says, among you. Go into Matthew chapter 21. Twice, there were those who were merging God's plan for worship with their plan for money. And so twice Jesus went into the temple, what's called sometimes cleansed the temple, where he drove out the money changers. He did that in John chapter 2, but that's a different occasion than Matthew chapter 21. Verses 12 and 13. He drove out those who bought and sold in the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers and in the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Is this the sword? This is Jesus bringing out the sword. Again, another occasion unique in how he attacked what was going on. Now, it's helpful to know it was not sinful to do any selling at the temple. In Deuteronomy 14 and verse 25, I won't turn and read it, but if you want to read that later, Deuteronomy 14:25, they were able to sell some animals for people who were traveling a long distance and couldn't bring the animal. You could bring money to Jerusalem and then buy the animal that you were going to offer. But Jesus said that they were making it a den of thieves. So the limited provision that was allowed was being expanded and then abused in a variety of ways. And so Jesus brings the sword. While some selling was permitted at the temple, when we come to the New Testament, is there any passage, any principles that would teach us that the church could do the same kind of thing, that the church could buy and sell for the purpose of profit, sell food, sell tickets to events, maybe have a camp or a campground, and okay, here the church is going to host this camp out for young people, and then even charge admission. Well, what in your mind could you go to a passage that would say, yeah, that's the church's business, and one of the ways that it raises its funds? Can a church sell workbooks? Can a church sell CDs? I've even seen that before. A group, even at one point, having claimed to be a Church of Christ, go to their website and here, order a CD. There are some churches claiming Christ that sell teaching materials. And they say, well, this is our ministry, is selling these teaching materials. Does God accept that? If not, then we've got to use the sword. Patiently, Paul told Timothy, preach the word with all long-suffering and doctrine. We can do that patiently. The sword can be skillfully used, not wild and crazy like Peter, just lopping off ears here and there. But there's a way to be trained in the use of this sword for a way that can potentially help others, and that's the goal. Further in Matthew 21, Jesus brought the sword out again. This was probably one day after he had gone into the temple, ruffled a few feathers. So I believe it was the next day that they came and found Jesus again teaching at the temple. And they asked, what in a different context or with the right attitude is a good question. In Matthew 21 and verse 23, they said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" That could be a good question. But, of course, there are reasons for asking it. They weren't interested in any answer that Jesus was going to give. And so in the following verses, Jesus brought the sword back out, and he made it clear, not just in answering them, but helped everyone there to realize that while these men are asking a good question, they're not really interested in the answer. Remember how Jesus did that? He said, "Well, I'll answer your question if you'll answer mine. What about the baptism of John? From heaven or from men? Where was the authority from?" You remember their answer? They kind of huddled over to the side, and if we say this or if we say that, okay, we just won't answer his question. Okay, well, we don't know the answer. And I've always thought that was interesting. What did the multitudes think when here the great leaders said, "We don't know"? Jesus shamed them. They had to bite their tongue to be willing to tell Jesus, "Well, we don't know the answer to your question." They didn't have the humility part, of course, either. And so Jesus helped everyone to see through their claim. They say authority, they teach authority, but when it comes to it, they're not so interested. So can we ask the same question today to people who, like the Pharisees or scribes or others, who say, "Well, what we do it's got to come from God"? Could we ask someone? Well, the baptism or the sprinkling of water that is called baptism, is it from heaven or from men? Would that be a fair question to ask someone? That's the same approach that Jesus used. What about church-sponsored recreation and games? Does the church need to be overseeing those kinds of things? Well, there's a Bible word called hospitality. Yes. Individuals and families inviting others into the home, but the church overseeing meals and games and camps and such, is that from heaven or from men? We've just got to ask the same questions that Jesus did, and the sword of the Spirit will do its work if we're willing to ask the question. And then one more in Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 and 3. Jesus said, "The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do." Jesus had strong words for them. If you remember the rest of Matthew chapter 23, this is pretty well known, where he talked about you vipers and whitewashed tombs. And what made them such? Well, one of the things was they say it and then they don't do it. Jesus had strong words for them. And he did not say that gloatingly nor even happily. In verse 37 is the time where he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I would have taken you under my wing like a mother hen does her chicks. But you weren't willing." And what did he mean they weren't willing? Well, he meant you say and you do not do. And so Jesus still uses that sword, and we've got to accept it and help others to recognize the same. Jesus even said this to one of his own churches in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 4. "If you do not repent," he says, "you have left your first love. And if you do not repent, I will take your candlestick out of its place." Would he say that to me? Would he say that to you? Would he say that to us? That we teach and we say, but we don't do. We do something, but we're not doing what we say ought to be done. Jesus has a solution to that, and it starts with the tip of the sword of the Spirit. So Jesus came to bring a sword, but did he take that sword back to heaven with him when he ascended in Acts chapter 1? Well, clearly not, because in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus said this is going to divide families, and makes the point that those who are not willing to get their hands dirty, those who are not willing to fight or at least not fight certain favored ones. Jesus says you will lose your life if you're not willing to follow me into the fight. So the same sword is available and the same sword is necessary today. And Paul taught peace, and Paul taught unity, and Paul taught love, and Paul taught in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand the wiles of the devil and wage the good warfare and fight the good fight, Timothy. He's talking about the same thing that Jesus was. And then last in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, maybe one of the passages that most plainly defines the nature of the sword and of the fight and of the battle. What is the nature of this battle? We've seen it on every occasion that Jesus spoke, but here's how Paul summarizes it. 2 Corinthians 10, 4 and 5. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Bringing my thought and your thought and his thought and her thought and our thoughts and their thoughts. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And so what Paul says here is the sword, the battle is, it's one of ideas and practices. It's one of teachings and doings. But it starts in the knowledge and the thoughts and the mind and the heart. That's where the battle is fought, and that's where the sword sticks. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. And so public debates are an effective tool. They help to compare thoughts with thoughts. Now, our society has many times in the religious realm, in the spiritual realm, has backed away from that and does not do that. It used to be more common. But there can still be private, may not call it a debate, but the private exchange and comparison of ideas, and which idea is consistent with what God has said, which idea is what God has said. That battle still has to go on, and it can be done in love, and it can be done with a genuine interest in the welfare of the other. It must be. That's how Jesus did it. But the point is, Jesus did it, and Jesus came to do that. Jesus came to impart, certainly other passages, and there'll be some other lessons like this. Why did Jesus come? He came as the Prince of Peace, but he also came as the commander of the kingdom. And God has given us the Bible so that we can wage the good warfare. And that's what our duty is this week. Examining ourselves and even helping others to examine themselves is to open God's book, see what God has said, say those things, do those things, and then make disciples. Persuade others to do the same. Hope this will somehow help us today, help us tomorrow, and prepare us for eternity. And we sing this song for that same purpose. Help us to reflect upon today, and if there will be a tomorrow, and to help us reflect upon eternity. If you're here this morning and you have not confessed your faith, and so you know that you're in your sin, then repent of your sins. And Jesus came to bring peace with someone who would be willing to confess their faith and to be baptized into the death of Christ and to be baptized into Christ. If that's your need, if as a Christian you've been fighting on the wrong side, then come back to Him. And He is lowly in heart, and you can receive the rest that you once had. We can help you in these ways, or some way, in serving the Lord. Come tell us how we could as we stand and sing.